Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to The Cosmic Connection. This is your place to explore the beauty and the order of the cosmos and your connection to it all. My name is Amanda Walsh. I'm the founder of Astrology Hub. I am here with Rick Merlin Levine, and we are so happy to be back with you all today. Oh, nice. I like that bow. That's so nice. Perfect. We're so happy to be back here with you all today. We're going to be talking about the 5 best uses of astrology. And on podcast episode number 276, we talked about the 5 misuses of astrology. So this is going to be a follow-up episode to that. And before we go there, I just wanted to make sure you all know that Rick's chart reading practice month, which is basically astrology in action, it's the perfect ending to the trilogy of Astrology Foundations 1, Astrology Foundations 2, and then Astrology in Action, which is going to be happening in August. We only have a wait list for it now, and that is available at,
astrologyhub.com/charts.
Thank you. Thank you. astrologyhub.com/charts. It will be 1 session a week for every week in August. It is perfect for those of you who have taken Astrology Foundations Level 1 and Level 2 and or 1 or 2. And if you haven't taken it, we still think it's going to be an amazing experience. You're going to get to watch Rick read charts of students live. He's going to read the chart and then he's going to explain to you as a student why he's reading it the way he's reading it.
And we'll also be able to then query the person whose chart's being read. So does that make sense or not? And if so,
Right.
How does it? And so there'll be real-time kind of feedback and a circulation between the act of reading, the act of teaching, and the person who's being read, feeding back what's happening for that person.
You're going to be on the hot seat, huh, Rick?
Well, it's the kind of thing you say, so did you prepare for today's course? And the answer is, yeah, for 50 years.
Exactly.
Because when you do something live, you're not on script. You might have things that you want to talk about, but you don't know how the client is going to act or react. And that's where the magic occurs.
Oh, yeah. And all the fun. So we're excited to invite all of you to that. Again, astrologyhub.com/charts. You cannot submit your chart yet to be considered for that experience because you will be able to when the enrollment is officially open. We will be giving priority to students of level 1 and level 2. If you haven't taken Astrology Foundations level 1 and 2, now would be a great time to do it because then you'll be all ready for August. You can do it at your own pace. That is at astrologyhub.com/foundations and astrologyhub.com/foundations2. Yes. All right. So just to recap, before we go into the 5 best uses, the 5 misuses that Rick identified on episode 276.
By the way, if you asked me today what the 5 misuses of astrology are, it's very likely I would come up with 5 different things than whatever it is we talked about then, just in the spirit of full honesty and disclosure. So what the hell did I say?
This is what you said. You said using astrology to ridicule something that you don't understand. So you were referring to like scientists and astronomers and people just using astrology as something to ridicule and put on a shelf.
Yeah.
2, relieving people of responsibility. So, I'm this, so I don't have to do that, basically. Right. Number 3, using it to try and outsmart Mother Nature. Okay, number 4, using it to confine, define, or limit. So putting someone in a box and then being like, okay, that's who you are and you're limited to that. Number 5, to use astrology to manipulate and control people. Okay, fantastic. So if you want to listen to that episode, it was really, really juicy, really good. That's episode number 276. On your podcast player or on YouTube, wherever you tune into Astrology Hub Podcast or on our website. And so let's talk about the 5 best uses of astrology.
We need a drum roll and we need David Letterman with the countdown.
We do.
The top 10 backwards. Well, I'm not doing these in any order. Just for the record, I mean, I have them in an order And I thought, well, that one's not the first. But beyond that, um, these are all what I would consider good uses of astrology. And also some of them, the boundaries on some actually overstep the boundaries on others, which we'll see as we go on. And I would start at the top of the list, and this is not working backwards up to the, we're not going the fifth, the fourth, and the most important is, I think perhaps the most important is what I would consider the top item on this list. It's all downhill from here. Is astrology as a tool for self-help and or therapy. And that's a very wide umbrella that we could actually spend the entire hour or so talking about and not going any further, because self-help has a lot of breadth and nuance to it. I would say that obviously the psychological component is strong to this. The fact that one of the most revered psychologists of the 20th century, and that would be Carl Gustav Jung, the fact that he was a serious student and practitioner of astrology, and until his later publishings and unpublished works came out, including the Red Book, people knew. I mean, he wrote about astrology. He wrote a book called Symbols of Transfiguration, and alchemical studies that were about the process of the psyche going through these changes using these archetypal, and that word archetype in the modern sense, although it comes from the Greek, certainly it comes from Carl Jung. And so we knew that there was a connection there, but until some of his unpublished writings came out, most people, even Jungians, didn't really have a sense of how important astrology was to Jung. Even, and I know we've talked about this, I think in Foundations 1 in that course, Jung didn't call his psychology the psychology, Jungian psychology, any more than Jesus called his teachings Christianity, or Buddha called his teachings Buddhism. Those names, or Freud called psychoanalysis Freudian psychology. But the fact is that what we call Jungian psychology, Jung called analytical psychology. That was his name for it. And the underline of that was analytical psychology, or the psychology of 4 types. I don't want to dig in deeply here. I just want to note that the 4 types were based upon the 4 Greek elements, fire, earth, air, water, which is the basis of modern astrology. And there are books written about the elements. I mean, that's how important it is, beyond just the signs. And so the connection of astrology to psychology and to therapy and to alchemy being the process of these what's the right word, metamorphosis that the psyche goes through in the journey of therapy, in that movement. This is an important, this is a high use of astrology. You will notice that one of my top 5 reasons will not be prediction of the future, although there'll be something that will touch close to that. Prediction is not, as far as I'm concerned, necessarily as valuable as we might think. There are cases in which what we might call forecasting steps into prediction, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the idea that for understanding who I am, and when I say that, I don't mean me as an Aries, I mean you as a Capricorn, and he, she, it, they as whatever sign and complex of planets and aspects each of us are, the understanding of how the mechanics that we live, but because astrology is a language, it gives us the ability to language those things that were previously invisible. Marshall McLuhan once said that the invention of language, basically created a bridge across the invisible boundaries, of psychic space. That without language, there was no way of bridging the gaps. And so the language of astrology in some ways allows us to make visible the behaviors that we know we are, but we don't necessarily put to words. Now, what that then allows us to do is it then allows us to become aware of those behaviors that are invisible to ourselves, that we might repress the reason why we're doing it. Repression is unconscious, we don't know. And or even those things that kind of seem to be repetitive patterns, we begin to get language for that, which then allows us to see that pattern more readily as it's occurring or even before it occurs, which then gives us the ability to make decisions, and then gives us the ability to grow and to change and to go through our own psychic metamorphosis, if you will. So astrology as a tool for therapy is incredibly powerful. Many modern astrologers would define themselves as psychological astrologers. I have an undergraduate degree. My only college degree is a bachelor of arts in psychology, but I've never been a practicing psychologist. However, I know many practicing psychologists, whether they are PhD psychologists, of which I know several, or whether they are masters in psychology that have degrees and licenses in counseling therapy, family therapy, various kinds of relationship counseling, so on. Even those who are degreeless, who might have certifications as life coaches. And these people, when they use astrology, it changes the nature of what they do. Why? Well, I've had relationships with psychologists who, when they had their chart done, said to me, my God, if I had this on every person that was coming to see me as a client, I would save 4 to 6 months to a year of therapy, which was the amount of time it takes to untangle things, because astrology often can be used, not that it's always used this way, as a tool, again, for making the unconscious conscious, for making the invisible visible. And as a self-help therapy tool, then it becomes an adjunct to whatever therapies you might be doing. Also here, in the reference of self-help, I would also include medical astrology. Not that I'm suggesting that anyone use medical astrology to create a diagnosis and therefore undergo a medical procedure based upon a self-diagnosis. This is not about being a licensed ND or MD. But the fact is that astrology as a tool of self-help enables us to understand the mechanisms of suppression, energetic suppression and repression, energetic blockages, which is more often than not the sources of medical conditions. And as many branches of modern medicine, whether you want to call it integrative medicine or complementary medicine, or even homeopathy or Vedic, which is not necessarily modern, they're all treated, or mind-body medicine, the medicine which has been, which has for the last 100 years or so fallen into the trap of modern science, and that is it's materialistic. And I don't mean materialistic as, gee, I want more of anything. It just means that if you can't see it, touch it, hear it, taste it, smell it, it doesn't exist. And yet modern physicians, healers, are going outside that materialistic model and understanding that energetics is very, very important. I think of a book by Edmund Whitmont. Whitmont is the author, called Soma and Psyche. Soma being the physical, psyche being the mental. And that interplay between the metaphysical and the physical is very, very important. So if you've never had your chart done, or people that have never had their chart done, these days, even going online and getting a chart and then looking up what planets and what houses, what they mean, and in what signs and what aspects, even if you're not a serious student, it's like holy crap, I'm just like that. How did they know? But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because the difference between seeing a what's the right word I'm looking for? A competent, experienced astrologer is the ability to integrate all of that stuff into an understanding, into a storyline that becomes your story. And so this whole idea of astrology as self-help is really about helping people, and certainly ourselves. I mean, we can all use it to help ourselves, but as someone who actually studies or uses astrology, professional or not, you then can use it also to help others find their place in the world, because it's a big fucking world. It's immense. It's infinite. And the fact is that we all have a very finite slice of that infinite universe. And astrology, therefore, becomes, I think, one of the most valuable tools in the toolbox for helping ourselves live a better life, accomplish more, be happier, and simply understand our place in the world. So that's item number one.
Fantastic. Well, in that level, I'm hearing the echo thing. I don't know if that's just me. Is anyone else hearing that? Sorry.
I don't know, but I can put on headphones really quickly. Sometimes that gets in the way, and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay. Thanks for your patience, everybody.
Yeah.
It usually does fix it. Alexander just had an aha moment. That's great.
Oh, good.
I love what James said too. It's very refreshing to listen to someone on social media that respects my own intelligence for a change. Thanks. Grateful.
Yeah,
awesome.
Well,
yeah. So Rick,
am I still echoing?
No, this is great. Thank you. It sounds like the self-help piece is clear, because you're gaining awareness of yourself through the chart. I mean, it's impossible not to start to have some new levels of awareness. And the therapy piece, it sounds like if the astrologer, if the therapist knows astrology, that's super powerful. Even if you, as the person receiving therapy, know astrology, that's going to help you language yourself better.
Yeah.
It sounds like the dream team would be both. The therapist knows astrology, and you, as the person receiving astrology, receiving therapy, also does.
I totally agree with that, except Jupiter always tells us that too much of anything isn't necessarily a good thing. And the danger with the client or the patient and the therapist both knowing astrology really well is to go off into analytical, non-experiential, rather than heartfelt feelings, to just go in the head and go, oh yeah, well, I have a Saturn opposed, Mars, and that's why everything's always frustrating. And right. And astrology is a great language to describe the lay of the land, but it's very different than living on that land. So it's just, so what you said is very true. It's just like anything, in proper measure, it's right. True. The right amount of salt in a sweet cookie is perfect, but you don't want a sweet cookie salty.
Very true.
I don't even want a sweet cookie, but I mean, yes. It's just the idea of things have to be in proper measure.
Right. And if we're going into the 5 misuses, like if either the therapist or the person receiving astrology is in that 5 misuses category, then it would be equally.
Well, yeah, then it falls into either that confining or that pre-labeling.
Right. You're this.
A friend of mine in the past used to say, and I don't know where this comes from, but it's very wise, and that is, a God defined is a God confined.
Yeah.
And I would say God, goddess, human, whatever, because as soon as we define something by describing it, we're actually we're putting a Saturn around it. We're putting a boundary. We're putting a circumference. That's what a description is. A known circumference around something to say that's inside that circle. So yeah, too much of that is not necessarily good. But
Okay.
this now then brings us, and before we go on, that when we use astrology to help ourselves, whether we know it or not, we are actually helping all those who have any contact with us. And this then becomes part of the cure to the problems of humanity itself. That if everybody just attended to their own crap, their own shit. And I put myself in this because, you guys out there know me from here, but like everyone else, I have a life. I screw up just like anyone else. And it doesn't matter how much astrology you know, we're still human. We still have a Chiron. We still have a place that hurts. We still have a moon. We still have hard aspects in our chart that kind of bring us back to our conflicts. We still have easy aspects in our chart that sometimes allow us to skate around the edges of things that we should be dealing with. And so as we do work on ourselves, and we've already described how using astrology can help that process, we are, in fact, not only working on ourselves, but we're improving our relationships with others, which then has an impact on their lives. And as their lives are improved, then that impacts others. And this is the way we save the world, or at least it's one of the pieces of the great puzzle. So that's before we move on to number 2. So number 1 is self-help / therapy. And incidentally, that self-help, although I'll talk about this much later in other uses of astrology that didn't make my top 5, not that they're not important, but self-help can at times be, for some people, although it's not the astrology that I necessarily practice, it can be using astrology to answer a question. I mean, that is a form of self-help. I just want to be as open as possible, because some people use an astrologer to help them pinpoint the correct time of an event, electional astrology, or a horary astrologer where they'll ask a question and astrology is used as a form of divination. And although those are not my types of astrology, and I don't practice them, I understand them. And it certainly is part of one of the uses of astrology. So I don't want to exclude that. Second, understanding human nature. Now, this is not about me improving my life, my success, my happiness, my individual relationships, or in any way necessarily contributing to my therapeutic process, whether or not I'm working with a therapist. But understanding human nature, and I would even extend that out beyond human nature, I would say understanding cosmology, which will bring us to the next point, which I don't want to get to quite yet, but it's part of the same thing that in all my years of study, although I am arguably not an academic, I dropped out of college after an undergraduate degree. I've read most of those books there and in the other rooms and so on. And although I'm not an academic, I'm pretty widely informed. And I say I'm not an academic. I can hang out with an academic and I'll say something and then I'll go on to something else and they'll say the first thing I said and they'll talk about that for 2 hours. And I had no idea. Really? I know a lot of, I'm a Gemini rising. I know a little bit about everything. No. Okay. So this idea though of understanding human nature is very important, because it's not just about knowing that I am an Aries with a Cancer moon. So although I can seem very pushy and forthright and so on, that often I'm feeling on the inside a lot littler than I am on the outside. An astrologer would know that someone who's an Aries with a Cancer moon that's self-help. The other piece though is that if I meet someone and I know that person is, let's say, a Cancer sun with, let's say, the moon in Libra, that I might know something very different about that person, even though as astrologers, we always have to be careful about jumping to conclusions because everyone wears their archetypes differently. But now I've stepped into a second use of astrology, and that's understanding human nature. And if I meet someone with a Saturn Mars square or opposition, I might make my quick astrological judgment only to talk to that person and find out, oh my God, this person wears this costume very differently than I would or that I might imagine. But at in any rate, what it allows me to do is it allows me to have conversations. And I'm not talking about as astrologer and client. I do have those conversations. But I'm talking about as human to human. Astrology gives me a language, whether the other person has that language or not, to step into topics that otherwise we might never go to. And so from that standpoint, it gives me an ability to understand human nature, to have conversations with people about things that would otherwise be invisible. And this is different than self-help, although quite frankly, ultimately, it might help me in being a better person or expanding my awareness or whatever. That's not what it's about. It's about understanding this whole larger scheme of things. And so that's point 2, is understanding human nature. A lot more to say about that, but I want to slide into number 3 because these, although I said these were in no particular order, self-help to understanding myself and others in relationship and the dynamics of the larger, then slide into number 3, which I called in my little list here, spiritual journey. And this is not, it kind of is an extension from understanding human nature, but it's really about a larger sense of kind of like being in touch with our intuition, with empowering our process of unfolding the self, not from a therapeutic standpoint, but from a standpoint of achieving, I'm going to use this word cautiously, enlightenment. Not that I believe that anyone, including myself or anyone that I've ever met, has achieved enlightenment. I think we achieve enlightenment for moments in time, and then we go back to being human. I mean, there may be some exceptions, and there may be some people who seem to have be able to develop lives or practices where they maintain that sense of being larger than one's personal self, and we call that, for lack of a better word, enlightenment. But we find ourselves often, based upon experiences that we have in life, on some sort of spiritual journey. And it often has nothing to do with astrology at all. It has to do with having a nun in school, hit a ruler on your hand one too many times, or in church, being in an inappropriate situation and finding yourself at the wrong end. Not that there's a right end of the abuse dynamic. Or simply reading passages from your religious text of preference, going, what? My God wouldn't say that, and so often as we get deeper into whatever religions that we were brought into, we often bump up against things that put us on some journey. Now, for some people, that ultimately deepens their relationship with that religion. There's no judgment here about religion as a thing. But as Ram Dass says, there's nothing spiritual about the 10 Commandments. They're orders of a religion. There's nothing spiritual about them. However, if you followed the 10 commandments as part of your practice in life and then stumble onto a spiritual path, you would be much more well prepared and eager to take that path. And so from that standpoint, many of us find ourselves at some point in our life on having the realization that we're on some sort of spiritual journey. Now, for some people, that lasts a few weeks or a few months or a year or a few years. And for other people, it lasts an entire lifetime. For some people, they go in and out of it depending upon, I'm going to say distractions, but I really mean life. Have a kid or 3 or 4 or 5 in an intense job and a couple of medical situations to deal with. And all of a sudden, that is your spiritual practice, And so there's no judgment here. But the observation is that when we are on a spiritual path and we're aware of it, it's much more likely that when we read about, hear about, or encounter astrology in any manner, rather than just going, that's stupid, we go, I wonder what's here. And therefore, astrology is not spiritual unto itself, but it certainly can become a very dynamic and important and supportive part of anyone's spiritual journey, because it takes one out of the illusion of thinking that self ends at my skin. Because if self ended at my skin, then astrology wouldn't work, because astrology in some ways is a good argument for what quantum physics called non-locality, because myself obviously is intimately connected with the motions of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Chiron, Eris, the moon, the sun, and so on. And if myself ended at my skin, how would that be possible? So from that standpoint, I think astrology as part of a spiritual journey is very profound and very powerful. And you often see people who are not astrologers, who are spiritual teachers, who acknowledge the importance of astrology. Not all of them. I mean, there are some spiritual traditions that put astrology over here, but in fact, there are many religious traditions that actually exclude the entire mystical or metaphysical side. Remember, the word religion comes from a Latin word religare, which means to tie or to bind. Religion is what ties us or binds us to a tribe. And, and I'm not using tribe in any sense of indigenous or, in any sort of pejorative sense at all. I'm using it. It's the family from which we come. And so religion is the practices to which we are culturally tied. And it's really only in modern times that so many people have had the freedom to say, I was born into this tribe, I was tied to that, but I quickly dispensed it, and my parents didn't care. They encouraged me to do whatever. But there was a time that if you declared your religion not valid, you would be excommunicated, which meant that you were out in the wilderness on your own and probably were doomed to a rather excluded, lonely, isolated, alienated life. That's not the way it is now, because so many people step onto a spiritual path with or without the religion that they came in as. But that's secondary. What's more important is finding yourself on that spiritual path. In the words of Matthew Fox, do you know Matthew Fox?
I feel like you've talked about him before.
Yeah, Matthew Fox was a priest, and he said he's said that the coolest thing on his resume was that he was personally fired by the Pope.
Wow.
And he was fired by the Pope because he refused to stop doing all-night drug-free raves in I think it was St. Mark's, in a church in San Francisco, that was keeping kids off the streets and putting them in a healthy spiritual environment, but somehow that was not okay. Matthew Fox has said many times that it doesn't matter where you dig the well, you get to the same water. And astrology becomes kind of like a I don't want to say proof, but a supporting piece in that, because astrology doesn't care whether you are Catholic or any denomination of Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or an atheist or Jain or a Buddhist. It doesn't matter. Astrology basically has to do with the archetypal cosmology that some people refer to as the perennial philosophy. I think Aldous Huxley called it part of the perennial philosophy, which basically comes through all traditions at all times when you get beyond the Saturnian rules of the religion that ties us to that religion. So I think that the astrology as part of a spiritual journey is incredibly important, because again, it's any tool that helps us realize that the ego, which is an important construct. There are many people who have such a negative, oh, that was an egoistic thing to do. Oh, the ego, let's get beyond the ego. You have to get rid of it. Without the ego, you wouldn't have food to eat for dinner and you wouldn't have a place to sleep, because the ego's job is the maintenance of the environment that allows the person or the self to continue to live. And so because so many religions, in which probably some of them would be really more akin to philosophies, quite frankly, like Hinduism, for example, the idea is that as you get rid of the ego, as you get above the ego, as you learn to not be attached to the needs of the ego, that this allows you to become enlightened. And in the case of Hinduism, just to pull this out of the whole pile, the goal is to get off the wheel. What's the wheel? It's the wheel of incarnation. It's the wheel of the cycle of incarnation, life, disincarnation, death, in between states, Bardos, reincarnation again, then being, and this endless cycle. And yet, as we become less and less attached to this illusion that there is something to Rick Levine that is not temporal, it just appears and disappears like vapor, like a storm coming through an area. It's just it's there and then it's not. And so we have this illusion now in more modern times that egos are bad. There's nothing wrong with an ego. It's just having it in proper proportion, because many people are so identified with their ego that it prevents them from going on any kind of spiritual journey. And this is where astrology comes in, because once you realize that there is, again, part of yourself that's beyond yourself, it kind of forces you to take another step or two further down that path of spiritual development. And I say path of spiritual development also with a little bit of caution. There's a wonderful book by Trungpa Chogyam Rinpoche, the not always best example of how to live one's life, but a silver-tongued Buddhist teacher who was the founder of Naropa College or Institute College in Boulder, Colorado. Because the idea is that, now I totally forgot why I was thinking of Trungpa. I do this rarely.
You never do this.
Oh, I'm totally out on a cliff. Catch me up. What was I saying?
Okay. Well, you were talking about the spiritual path and the journey and the ego.
No, thanks. That's it. That's all I needed. Okay. So one of his books, of which he has many excellent books, is called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And spiritual materialism is not about buying. It's not about what cool crystals, fluorite, that you might have. It's not about buying things that are spiritual. It's about the idea that the materialistic part of spirituality is that we're on a path and there's something to get to next. Many people that are on a spiritual path, they go, oh, so what do you do? Oh, well, I've done this enlightenment, this empowerment. I've taken this seminar and I'm enrolled for that, as if that trajectory is making their spiritual path or development better or more advanced than ours, because we've never taken any of those courses. And so the idea, the danger of thinking of the spiritual journey as a place that I start here and I get there. That's what he's saying, cutting through that idea that that's not the way it is. It's just being in the moment and doing whatever it is that we need to do, can do, to become more aware of the spiritual. We forget the word spiritual, what it means. People go spiritual journey, spiritual path. Spirit is simply consciousness without physicality. Soul is consciousness with physicality, but it's the portion of that consciousness with physicality that's not physical. Very, very specific difference. So the spiritual journey is the journey that is not about those things that are physical in my life. It's not about who I think I am. Who am I? That's, this is a construct, and it's an ego construct. And so astrology as an adjunct is the word I was looking for before, to a spiritual journey, is basically a tool to keep us reminded of the fact that the universe isn't a big place and I'm a tiny little nothing. I'm immense enough that I contain the entire universe. And I'm kind of paraphrasing a very well-known Rumi quote. But that's certainly part of a spiritual journey. And I think it's one of the higher uses of astrology, in that, using it for that process.
Oh, yeah. I think I've told the story several times of my first astrology reading. And so I had 13 years Catholic school, took like every world religion class in college, master's in psychology. So this what is human nature? Who am I? Who are you? And then this idea of like, who is God and what is God? I was such a seeker, like always wanting to answer these questions, but never finding them. And sitting there having my first astrology reading with tears streaming down my eyes, realizing that this was the first true evidence that I had of some divine intelligence, some God, quote unquote, source, whatever, was from this circle and some squiggles and this beautiful woman, Natasha Alter, who could translate that for me. And it was like, oh my gosh, amazing. I've been looking for this the whole time and I had no idea. So for me, it's
Hi, Natasha.
Hi, Natasha. So for me, it's become this anchor on the spiritual journey. It's like this touch point that is always reminding us, reminding me of a bigger perspective.
Yeah.
That's not all just what's happening here in this little body, in this little life. There's something more to the whole game.
Yeah. And for me, for many people I know, it was that moment of a reading, often because of some crisis going on. We'll get to that in a moment. But for me, astrology came in early on as one of many things in my search for meaning that really began in my junior high school days. I didn't know that's what I was doing then. But when I look at the books I was reading on hypnosis, on psychic development, on UFOs, on hypnotism, many people don't know, but as a high school student, I taught myself hypnosis, and I was good enough at it that I did it at parties. I mean, it's offensive to me now, so don't tell anyone. But astrology came in on the same flow as palmistry, numerology, tarot, phrenology, reading the bumps on someone's head, all kinds of alternative ways of thinking about things. But of all of them, although many of those things I still am totally involved in, totally interested in, astrology became kind of the leader of the pack, because it becomes, and I know I've said this in other talks, either here or in the foundation teachings or in other teachings, because astrology actually is like the corpus callosum, that piece in our brain that connects the right hand and the left hand. The right hand being the left brain, the left hand being the right brain, the male and the female, the thinking, the feeling, however you want to look at these two hemispheres. And astrology being that connective tissue between, here's two opposites, time and space. Now, Albert Einstein connected time and space. like impossible to do in Newtonian mechanics. I don't want to delve down this rabbit hole. We've been here before. But the fact of the matter is that time and space used to be two totally separate things. Time was something that happened independent of space. You know, Newton's clock went tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, and a tick tock was always the same length no matter what. And then Einstein comes along and goes, wait a minute, the faster you go, the slower the tick tocks get, until you reach the speed of light, at which point time stops. Boom, crash. Time and space are interrelated, and astrology is one of the most magical tools because it allows us to work inside of a toolbox that's a metaphor for relating time and space.
Wow.
Astrology, spiritual journey.
Right.
That's number
three. That was number 3. Yep.
So the 1, 2, 3 went from self-help to kind of a larger context to cosmology.
Yes.
And again, we've talked here, and even the name of the show, The Cosmic Connection, that the word cosmos comes from a Greek word meaning both order and beauty. And cosmology is simply the logos, the needing to understand logos also being a word that we often misassociate with logic, because logos is the word. If in the Bible, in the beginning there was logos. And logos is the word. And the word is not any word like, hi, Amanda, or porcupine. The word is a word that actually gives vibration to something that has not yet manifest, that is pregnant for manifestation. And so that's what logos is, and astrologos is the logos of the stars, And so from that standpoint, I think astrology becomes part of a cosmologos because it's larger than just what's my chart, your chart. Number 4, a broad term that's going to encompass it's going to encompass why many people find themselves astrologers, more like you, less like me, and that is crisis management. And what I mean by that is that if you go see an astrologer because your 15-year marriage has just fallen apart, or because someone you know dearly is something has happened to them, or they're sick, or you're having problems in a parent-child relationship, there's some sort of crisis. You go to the astrologer because psychology didn't work, the medical doctor didn't work, the priest or the minister or the rabbi didn't, or the imam or whoever. None of these people worked. And so you go to the astrologer in last hope, and you sit down, and 15 minutes into it, you're bawling because it's the first time you've ever been seen. And you've been seen in a way that no one has ever seen you. And so this becomes astrology as a tool for crisis management. And I would bring into this best use of astrology. And I said earlier at the very beginning, when I said something about prediction and forecasting getting close, and I said, we'll come close to that later, we'll cycle back around. Well, this is that moment, because crisis management often then kind of stumbles into these areas of prediction. If I know that your sun in your chart is at 15 degrees of Aquarius, for example, or 15 degrees of any fixed sign, I know that Saturn is going to either be conjuncting it, squaring it, or opposing it now. And when I say now, I mean this month, this year, into early next year because of the retrograde motions, and that Uranus is or will be squaring it, opposing it, or conjuncting it. As an astrologer, I know that this can be a crisis. Now, that doesn't mean that if you came to me as a client 4 years ago, I would have said 2021, 2022, be careful, man. That's a crisis year for you. Your life's going to fall apart. There's a prediction, or, oh, your marriage is so stable, or this occurs in your 5th house of children. You have 4 kids. I think that, they're going to rebel against you and call you, a bad mom or dad. we can dig into a chart and we can come up with these words by in a way what I would call over prediction. And I'm not saying that one should never do that, because there are some incredibly competent astrologers who have tools that's what they strive to do. I just don't know how useful it is. It's like if someone tells you that you're going to get a flat tire in your front right tire in about 6 weeks and there's nothing you can do about it, why bother telling me? I'll worry about it for 6 weeks. And when it happens, I'll still have to deal with it in the moment. I might go out and spend $800 and buy 4 new tires for my car and still get the fucking flat tire. What that kind of prediction to me. Now, granted, there are things in both the Hellenistic tradition and in the Vedic tradition which are more oriented, and even the medieval tradition, and even the more modern Uranian cosmobiology tradition, that are more oriented toward prediction. But for me, I would not put that as one of my 5 best uses of astrology. For me, the best use of seeing someone having a difficult transit coming up, or a potentially difficult transit coming up, because someone will go through that transit and everything magical will happen. What's the difference? Well, it has to do with preparation and awareness. And so the question then becomes, back to number 1 and 2 of self-help and understanding, or therapy and understanding human nature, is how do I use this upcoming potential crisis as a marker in my spiritual journey so that I can spend the next 3 years not fearing it, but building on the inside and strengthening who I am, so that when I encounter this bump in the road, that it's a bump in the road and not a stone, divider wall that I'm trying to cross or hit. So astrology as a tool of crisis management, not all crises are life stopping. We have little crises every day. We have a tight schedule and someone calls up and says, I'm running 10 minutes late. It's a crisis. Oh, well, I had something on the other end. I'll call you right back. Boom. Can I come in? No problem. Okay, call back. Hey, everything's cool. I'll see you 10 minutes late. But that was a crisis. And astrology as a tool, not only for crisis management, but for crisis, I don't want to say prevention, but for minimizing the damage or the potential chaos of a crisis. Now, some crises require chaos, because chaos is, as we know from talking about the ongoing squares between Pluto and Eris, or even transits of Uranus. Chaos is often necessary to wake us up, to get our attention. Without the chaotic structures, without things falling apart, sometimes we can just maintain our sleep state forever. So chaos isn't necessarily a bad thing, although it sucks in the moment often. But even just following the planetary movements. I mean, this morning, we are recording this on the afternoon of June 10th, 2021, for those people listening to later. This morning, we had an eclipse of the sun, a Gemini new moon annular eclipse of the sun. That was very powerful. And even as an astrologer, knowing this and knowing the high frequency buzz of the Gemini energy and knowing all the other stuff, and my purpose here isn't to get into delineating this special new moon, because solar eclipses are special cases of the new moon, that we therefore can begin to see unfolding time rather than as series of crises, whether they be large crises or tiny minor crises that 10 minutes later we don't even remember. There's a boom, boom, they're here and gone. That by using the rhythm of these processes becomes another tool in the management of what potentially could be a larger crisis. Mm-hmm. So that's the short version of number 4, crisis management.
And would you say you're referring more to sort of proactive forward-looking crisis mitigation in some ways?
I would.
Okay.
Then
also, but even amidst crisis, it's very helpful because then it does that thing where you get to see it from that larger perspective. And go ahead.
I was going to say, absolutely what you're saying is true, but no, absolutely what you're saying is true. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches us that we can't give a person in a non-physical transitionary state, which is what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is about, the person journeying between the between states, between death and rebirth. You can't teach a person or a consciousness about that while they're going through it. You can remind them of what they've been taught when they were able to think things slow enough and thoroughly enough that they could understand it. I'll give you another example. You can't teach someone how to repair or raise a sail on a complex sailing ship in the midst of an intense storm. Mm-hmm. They have to know what they're doing. And in fact, if you're the expert and you know what's going on and you're working with someone who knows what's going on in the midst of that storm, you might say, the wind is doing this and that. And, instead of doing this, we might try doing that because that seems to work better. And the person goes, of course, good idea. Mm. You can't teach someone how to cook when 50 people are coming over for dinner in an hour. So this is the problem with using astrology in the midst of a crisis, because in the midst of a plutonic meltdown, we're not going to hear anything the astrologer says. Why? Because we're in the midst of a goddamn meltdown.
Yes.
Stop talking at me. I see your mouth moving and I hear the words coming out of your mouth. This is not meaning anything to you. My husband just left me. My wife just died. My parents just disowned me. I just lost my job, whatever. Stop. But if that person had been well trained into understanding the nature of, let's say, Uranus, if it was a Uranus or a Pluto transit, then the guide, the friend, the astrological savvy, associate, buddy, friend, therapist, whatever, might say, do you remember for the last 2 years, we've been talking about how Pluto is meltdown and it's so big that things can happen that you absolutely lose control. And that's part of a process of then slowly regaining control and putting your life together like a butterfly regains control of a melted, dead caterpillar. I'm just reminding you that that's where we're at. That's what's going. Sure, I remember. I can connect that thought to now because I had it then. So this is even all more important why we use astrology as mitigation prior to the divorce or prior to the event. It doesn't have to be a divorce.
I think a few things, even if you can't hear the astrology when you're in the crisis, there are still a few ways astrology, at least I've found in my own life, it's still helpful. Number one is the confirmation that you're not necessarily going crazy, that it's actually, you can see in the chart that you're in a very tense moment in your life.
Yes, but sometimes it's a confirmation that you are going crazy and there's nothing, there doesn't have to be something wrong with that in that moment.
True.
And I don't mean clinically here. This is not a clinical judgment.
Yes. Two, and this is, again, I'm just speaking from my own experience, is the understanding that whatever's happening was actually written, that you could have looked 20 years ago and seen that there would have been an intense configuration of energy for you at that time, also helps to alleviate some of the, oh my God, I did something so wrong. I messed up. I wasn't supposed to, blah, 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 all that. And then the third thing in the crisis that can be helpful, I'm not saying always, but it was for me at least, was that it's happening for a reason. That it's not, that there is actually an invitation here and an opportunity here to meet something and to grow into something. But again, I get you. When things just suck, I mean, then there's also like, this just sucks. I don't really care about any of that stuff.
In theory, I'm going to agree with you. In practice, I'm not convinced that everything happens for a reason. We can make up a reason, and
Yeah.
astrology sometimes can help us make up a reason, but
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that happened for a reason. Whether we like it or not, the universe isn't necessarily A, fair, or B, it's not necessarily responsive to karma at every moment in time. Bad people do bad shit and get away with it. Good people do good stuff and don't get noticed. And I'm not saying that either of those are a reason to either do or not do good or bad stuff. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I think it's a bit new agey and oversimplistic to say that that once we know what's going on, then there's a reason. The reason is Pluto squaring my natal sun or whatever. Well, that's no reason. Why did this have to happen? Not that. Why does this happen again and again? But the other thing that you touched on was something that I would call blame and shame. And that is the idea that astrology, and this goes back, I think, in some ways to 1, 2, and 3, self-help, understanding human nature, and spiritual journey. And that is that astrology, that oftentimes when something happens, we're way too quick to blame someone else for what's going on for us. Sometimes that person actually should be blamed. Just saying. One can say, well, yeah, you had a part in it. And I would say, well, maybe, but not always. When a baby is born into a certain situation, and then the person goes, well, they chose that. I don't know. I don't know if that's always the case. I don't know how much is, I don't know where the dividing line between fate and free will is. Although, and I've talked about this before in previous episodes here, that I think fate and free will are coexistent, and that any given moment, the more we know about fate, the less we have of free will, and the more we know about free will, the less we are at the hands of fate. But I think that astrology can help alleviate, and I think this is what you were saying, but I'm just languaging it slightly different. Astrology can help alleviate the personal blame. I'm blaming this person, because we see the wider energetic construct. And it can also alleviate the I must have done something wrong, because we see these patterns. And yes, one can say, well, it wouldn't have had to happen in this way or this bad or this difficult, but it allows us to, instead of putting blame on someone else or ourselves, which is really what shame is, putting blame on ourselves, it allows us to look at these pieces and to begin to work with them. And sometimes we work with them in very tiny little ways, not just in large, magnificent life changes. I mean, we look at people who have these epiphanies and they change their life, but their muscles are still in the same shape. And a year or 3 years or 20 years later, they're dealing with the same issue, because although they changed the big thing, they didn't change the higher frequency vibrations that are feeding the bigger thing. But all of this basically has to do with crisis management, and it's one of the best uses of astrology, or crisis mitigation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
or crisis avoidance, but not crisis denial, because there we get into trouble.
Right. Yeah. I guess I was just speaking from direct experience. Those are the things when I was going through it, is like, this is really helping me get through this massive meltdown in my life, like massive. Sure. And I think, when I was talking about the blame and shame thing, specifically around divorce for me, there was, when you could look in my children's charts and see that divorce was very likely for them, to be able to go, well, okay, well, this was the configuration that is written. There's something about that was just like, okay, well, then we're rolling with it. Like, this is what's happening. This is what's happening. And it's not necessarily a bad thing,
Well, yeah, and that whole there's a story from the Zen teachings in China, where this village Zen master is the school teacher, and his son goes off, looking for hunting, and he doesn't come back. Normally, he goes away for a day or two. A week goes by, no sign of him. the villagers all come and go, "Oh, master, this is awful. Something terrible has happened. We're so sorry." And the Zen master replies, "Good news, bad news, who's to know?" And a few days later, his son comes back with 2 wild horses that he couldn't ride, but he had them, in lead, and he had to, and it took a long time to get back. And all the villagers flocked and said, "You're the luckiest guy. Your wealth is amazing now. These 2 horses are amazing, blah, 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 blah." And he said, "Good news, bad news, who's to know?" And a few days later, his son is breaking in. One of the horses gets thrown and breaks his leg. And all the villagers come and go, "This is terrible. It's planting season. Your son won't be able to help you with planting. This is a tragedy. We're so sorry. Good news, bad news, who's to know?" A couple days later, the king's army comes through town, conscribing all the young eligible men. They can't take his son because he has a broken leg. You get it. Yeah. When we're going through the stuff, sometimes the absolute best things turn out to be awful. And sometimes the absolute worst things turn out to be the biggest blessings. Yeah. At any rate, astrology allows us to have perspective,
yes,
a wider perspective over whatever the pressure of the momentary crisis is. And that's, I think, the real value, or
absolutely
one of the top 5.
Yes.
Now we're at 5.
Yes. Number 5.
Well, number 5 is an interesting one. And I left it for last because it's a slightly different category, but I think it really is one of the best uses of astrology. And just like we use astrology to look back over an entire lifetime and see the bumps and the expansions and the contractions and the tests and the rewards of our life going all the way through our life, by the same token, we can do that historically. And so number 5 as a best use of astrology is to reframe history so that we not only know what's going on in our individual lives when we're having a crisis, but so that we know what's going on socially, globally, politically, economically when the world is having a crisis. I mean, anyone who has lived through 2020 and 2021, for that matter, anyone who lived through the 60s. Those were my years of becoming. I was, teenage and early 20s, in the mid-late 60s, early 70s. Anyone who lived through that period of time knows what, crisis, of government or of social condition is. There are other periods, and depending on where you are on the globe, whether you were a resident in Bhopal, India during the chemical disaster there, or whether you lived in certain parts of Africa or in Armenia or in World War II, World War II Germany, when there were ethnic cleansings of various sorts. I mean, these are horrific moments in history, but then there are also brilliant moments in history. And when we look at them through the astrological filter, which we've done here on Cosmic Connections many times, last year with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction opposition cycle, with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction opposition cycle, that was the great mutation back in December of 2020, or now this week with the second of 3 Saturn-Uranus squares, we look at what's going on out there and we go, oh my God, this is not normal. I remember Terence McKenna once saying that if an alien came to Earth during this period of time, it would be like meeting a female human being during childbirth, and the alien thinking that's the way humans were.
Yes.
Because in a way, this period of 60, 70 years from the 60s up through the 2020s, 2030s, it's like a cultural childbirth in a way. And this is not normal. Well, it may be the new normal, but the point is that when we look at astrology, and we are the first generation that's had this ability, astrologers going back in history did not have this ability. I mean, there were breakthrough astrologers like the French astrologer André Barbeau, who looked at these slower moving planetary cycles and unfolded them in history. But, until the past 15, 20 years, there was no way to say, well, where were the planets on the day that the Emancipation Proclamation were signed? boom, 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 doom, 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 type in a few things, hit enter. Pluto is in this, and look, that was square that, and that would have taken days of calculations. And so we have reached a point where, just like individually, we can use astrology to help us make better decisions in our personal life based upon, well, what did I do when Saturn was last conjuncting my sun? What did I do what happened when Saturn was squaring or conjoining my, hold on. So we are the first generation to be able to take astrology out of the personal and put it into the collective consciousness. And remember, those people who have good memory, like, I mean, I can't remember someone's name I met this morning, but I do remember other shit that other people don't remember. And I do remember a term from 9th grade biology, which was ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
Ontogeny recapitulates what?
Ontogeny, which is ontogeny is the history of an individual. It's the genesis of the person. Phylogeny is the generation of the entire phylum, the species. Recapitulates obviously just means it goes through the same cycle. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny is the biologist's way of noting that a human being starts out as a one-celled organism and then moves through stages where it looks like an amphibian, it looks like a reptile, it develops a backbone, it goes through the evolution of the human phylum itself, or the human species. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. My individual history recapitulates the history of the world. Now, there were two brilliant historians that have kind of fallen aside, named Herbert Marcuse and Norman O'Brown. Now, Marcuse was normally grouped in with these 1960s Marxist historians, if you will. And Norman O'Brown was a psychoanalytic Freudian academic. But both of them wrote about something that had to do with cultural enlightenment. And in fact, Norman O'Brown's most famous book, called Love's Body, basically said not only does ontogeny recapitulate phylogeny, but the history of the culture recapitulates the individual history. Meaning that history goes through its anal retentive stage, its oral stage of these are the psychosexual development stages, that as we look at history and we see it developing through an adolescence and into an adult stage and so on, that history itself, you can run a psychoanalytic timeline and mark points at which you can see different moments in history evolve. And so this concept of this interplay, of this fractal interplay between the history of the self, the history of culture, and with astrology, we are the first generation that actually gets to play with concepts. We get to read books like Rick Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, which is an encyclopedic manifesto of the history of the intellectual history and history of technology of the world, but tying that to astrology. And he's certainly not the only person. And this is certainly part of one of my fascinations, love of history and teachings. This is often where I go when things begin to unfold. And simply by looking at, for example, the current Uranus, Saturn square Uranus, and to see that in light of the previous Saturn opposed Uranus and the previous Saturn square and the previous Saturn conjunct, and going back, all of a sudden you see this tide, rise, fall, rise, fall, rise, fall, except over a period of time that's normally out of our intellectual capability of grasping. So I think one of the best uses of astrology, and I don't think we've applied this as a culture yet, but I think we're going there. And that is the understanding that history itself actually responds to these events, these events like Saturn square Uranus, and that we can look backwards and even in current news and put shit that we just think is crazy into perspective. Crisis. It's crisis management.
Exactly.
Instead of on an individual basis, we're now talking on a global basis.
Yeah. So, I mean, next time Saturn Pluto comes around, if we're smart, we'll be looking at that and tracking that. And as a culture, as a civilization, we could be anticipating and making decisions leading up to that.
That's right. But if we're really smart, we won't be looking forward to the next opposition in 2034, I think, or whatever it is. Instead of that, 2034, or somewhere in there. Instead of looking forward to that, we'll be looking forward to every day. What can we do now that in some way works off of the craziness that happened in 2020? So that doesn't slip into unconsciousness, slip into denial, and then spurt back up at the square, slip back into denial, and then explode again, as it does often on these kind of metronome, points. Yeah. And so, we can use it for crisis mitigation and or pre-crisis management, rather than just looking forward to that moment in time going, oh my God, it's going to happen again.
Well, and like you said, minimizing potential chaos. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Yes. I know there were a few other things you wanted that didn't make the list, but there were a few other things that you wanted to just...
Very briefly, I don't want to dig deep on any of these. A couple I touched on. Astrology can be used as a tool for divination. I mean, all forms of astrology in some ways are divination, because what are we doing? We're extending our consciousness into the divine proportion that's outside of Earth. And that gets us back to the spiritual path. But astrology can be used for pure research in almost anything that we're doing, whether it's biochemistry, whether it's medical research, the timing of delivering certain medications, which in certain traditions is actually important. Astrology can be used for financial purposes. Not my best use of astrology, but then again, I'm not in the 1%. I'm not even in the 10%, so, but it's because that part of astrology has never interested me, or has not interested me as much as the spiritual development or the psychological portion. But there are many people who can be spiritual and still use astrology to better understand finances, the timing of commodities, stock markets, cyber currency, and so on. And then there's the use of astrology for outsmarting Mother Nature, which I said it's never wise to outsmart Mother Nature. On the other hand, it's also never wise to plant your flowers in September if you live in Montana.
Right.
So there is, again, too much of anything is not good.
That's working with Mother Nature.
Right. And the word for that is theurgy. This is a real word. And ergy comes from the Latin erg, which is work. Matter of fact, an erg in physics is a unit of measurement to measure how much work has occurred. Work meaning the force of something and its movement. Theurgy is basically theo, like in enthusiasm, which is with God, or like theology is the logos of God. Theurgy is working with God. And in fact, I had this book earlier because this is one of the better uses. This is Caroline Casey's book, Making the Gods Work for You. And I wanted to bring this up only because it's a good example of theurgy. And that is that it's not about outsmarting Mother Nature. It's not about doing something that's not a wise thing to do and picking the best time to do it and going, I made it happen anyhow. It's not about forcefully overwhelming natural forces to push through with some personal agenda. Mother Nature don't like that. However, when we are performing theurgy, when we are doing rituals at the right time, when we are living in what might be called a karma yoga world, where we're doing right action, when we are, as Caroline says, making the gods work for you. This is all basically working with nature. So electional astrology, which is the astrology of picking the best time for an event, certainly can be working with the natural forces. Again, Jupiter creeps in here, and that is that it sometimes enables us to think that there's some moment that if I do this, it'll make everything just be right. And that's not the case, because even in those things which have been elected and done absolutely right, 20 years later, when the marriage falls apart or when the business fails or whatever, we go, oh yeah, look at that. I didn't notice, but that the midpoint of that Saturn, Mercury, whatever it is. And then we go, yeah, well, so it's never all good news or bad news. And then the other thing, which can be a best use of astrology, but again, it's a Jupiter thing, which is too much or wrong audience, and that's astrology as entertainment. And remember that, I would like to get on my, moralistic high horse and go, astrology as entertainment is just a waste of energy. However, it's one of the ways in which people become open to astrology. In other words, someone is entertained by astrology, and to the point of going, I followed the 10 commandments. I'm spiritually inclined. This is funny. This is really cool. Maybe there's something here that I need to explore. So entertainment astrology, I think, is an important piece of the spectrum. But it's also something that we can Jupiter out on and do too much of. I'm sure there are others.
Oh,
and
yeah.
If other people, if you're here in the chat room and you have other best uses of astrology, go for it.
Yeah. Or ways that it's been particularly helpful for you. So we would love to hear from you. Rick, that was brilliant, as always. We have self-help therapy, number 1. Number 2, understanding human nature. Number 3, an adjunct to the spiritual journey. Number 4, we have crisis mitigation and management. And number 5, we have a way to reframe history. And
maybe reframe, recreate, or reframe. It's almost like cultural therapy, rather through history rather than individual. But those are the 5 that I came up with. And again, I'm sure there are many others. I'm sure I missed something important. That's what struck me.
Well, and there's lots of cross-pollination, because like you said, the cultural therapy or reframing history is also crisis mitigation, but at the cultural level. At the, humanity level. Yeah. So yes. Wow. Amazing. Rick, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you in the chat. It's been so fun to hear how activating this is for all of you. Lots of love for you in the chat, Rick, if you have a chance to go in and look at some point. And make sure you sign up for our chart reading extravaganza, which is going to be all of August.
I like the word extravaganza. That's another Jupiterian word.
I know. I've been wanting to find a way to use it in a course or an event, and my team always is like, "Oh no, here Amanda goes with extravaganza again." But sometimes it feels like that. It just does. Yeah. So that's going to be all of August. We only have a wait list so far. You can't enroll yet, but get on the wait list. You'll be the first to know when enrollment opens. That is astrologyhub.com/charts. Rick, thank you. It's just it's another opportunity to fall in love with astrology again and again and again. Yes. So thank you for doing that for us, with us. And thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks for being a part of our community. Thank you for making astrology a part of your life. Please do put in the chat, if you're watching this live, you can do it. But if you're watching the recording, you can do it as well, because we do go back and look at the comments. So what are your best uses of astrology? How does it impact your life? So thank you for being here, and we will catch you same time, same place next week. All right, everybody. Thank you and take care. Thank you, Rick.